And some of the stuff that like started to come out, kind of like moving away from the off season, like James Jones said something like while all of this was going on and both camps were relatively quiet.
Sure.
This was something that was said in a press conference in regards to like players leaving, right? And like how that is handled. And I had like a couple of questions in regards to that. So for players, like super emotional, right? Anytime it's like the end of a tenure with a team or an end of a career or what have you, right? Always going to be an emotional thing. You know, income is going away. You know, you have roots within an organization, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you balance the business side of like being the gatekeepers of the organization, right? While also managing people and all the emotions that come along with it.
Yeah. You're right. It is difficult. The average career in the NFL is 3 years. My experience, in terms of as a player and how my career ended, it was really ugly. I mean, so based on what I've always tried to treat all our players fairly, and you have to make difficult decisions. Usually, for most players, there's injury involved. So, you want them to feel as though they're treated fairly. The other thing, obviously, with the salary cap system we have, it's often their financial decisions. You'd love to keep everybody, but you've got to weigh a lot of different things that you take into consideration. And I have great respect for Ted Thompson and both Brian. I think feel the same way. It's a tough business, and you have to make difficult decisions, but you still can make them in a way where the players feel at least they've been treated fairly
and respected. And that's like
what Ted always said, we should treat them like they're our own sons.
So in terms of like you've had players think that like things could have been handled differently, and again, it's subjective, right? So it's going to vary from player to player. So how do you, I guess, again, like display that level of like respect towards a player while also like telling them like, hey, like we're,
I think you just have to be honest. It's like, this is why we're making the decision to move on. And I think the transition is harder the longer you're in the longer you play, and especially if you're just in one organization. I know, James Jones came back, and Randall Cobb's back now, and I think having kind of been through the league and been to other teams, you have a little different perspective.
Sure.
We're very unique, I think, because of our ownership structure.
Agreed.
The fan support that we have, and obviously we don't have a rich, deep-pocketed owner, and I think by and large, I think that's more of a positive for us, the ownership structure that we have. But there's obviously some great organizations out there, but it is about the people, not organizational structure.
Very much so.
Yeah.
In terms of when it's time to evaluate a player and potentially move on, and salary cap, contracts, financials, I'm going to kind of put that to the side because that's pretty self-explanatory, right?
Yeah.
Especially with what happened with COVID and, how structured things are and not a lot of wiggle room. How do you go about as an organization determining like when it's time to move on from a player or coach? Because we've had scenarios where whether it was a coach and like the statistics, like the stats like started declining a bit and then a decision was made, or there's a player and you mentioned like injury, what is kind of considered when moving on from anyone within the organization?
Yeah, well, obviously it's very different between coaches and players. I think from a player perspective, a lot of it is injury history, age.
Sure.
Salary is oftentimes can, it's kind of a, as your salary gets higher, and sometimes it's, do we want to extend them or, and if they have an opportunity to go on somewhere, you can look at it and it's probably not worth trying to match it.
Yeah.
So I think with a lot of players, it does come down to kind of their age and what's the chance of them being able to continue to stay healthy.
Yeah,
it's really difficult, to predict those things. I mean, you've had players.
It's a gamble.
They are injured all the time the first couple of years, and you think that's a pattern, and then they go on to have great careers after that. So no, it's kind of like the draft is it's a guess.
You do the bet. Yeah, exactly. You're just like throwing darts at the board and be like, I hope this does well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you have to have trust in your process, and and the medical opinions are very important, and it's not just injuries; it's the aging process. I know there's a movie out now about where you're aging really quickly, but the NFL is kind of like that. You age, just your body, the wear and tear on your body, and and I know our scouts and Brian. There's things that you look at and that you can see. Just the players aren't moving at the same way they did early in their careers. But there's players like that are just freaks that
it's like we're never just going to keep playing forever. Yeah. And
like Charles Woodson. I mean, 18 years as a defensive back. It's unbelievable.
Now Hall of Famer. I think, and just to focus on players before we move to coaches, in terms of those, like, I guess those intangibles, there's been a lot of talk about like high character players, right? Is that, I don't even say is that even considered, but is that something that like kind of crosses the mind of like how they are in the locker room? So maybe their production has tailed off.
Well, you look at everything. I mean, character, I view it more as leadership. Are they somebody that is going to help lift the team?
Sure.
There's a lot of different things you take into consideration, and a lot of times it's like you said, whether it's a draft or scouting, it's kind of a feel. And if you have, the longer you've been at it, you've got a lot of experience, and
more often than not you hit, and then you're not. In terms of coaches, so like you said that like that's a very different process, right? Because you don't have to worry about injury.
Hopefully not.
Exactly, right?